in New York and Washington, D.C. Good afternoon, good evening for our European colleagues. It's a wonderful day in Virginia. It's about 30 Celsius today. It's just incredible. I hope you also in a good mood. I know it's a difficult time, but we continue. Life goes on. We continue our seminars, our webinars, and today our guest, our speaker or discussant will be Professor Martijn Icks, my colleague and friend. I will be hosting this meeting. My name is Shiraev. I'm here in Virginia, United States, George Mason University, actually my home. It's about 11 miles away. Anyway, I'm here, and this is our third event. We represent CARP, a lab which studies character assassination. Just we are sociologists, political scientists, psychologists, historians, and other affiliates. Well, the rule's very simple. I will ask Martijn a few questions, and he will. I'll be almost invisible, although I'll be present on the screen. And then anybody who wants to ask a question, just raise your hand, type the question here in the chat room, or simply, I think Martijn agrees, if you want to talk in person and show yourself, or just ask question in person without typing, please do so. We'll be very happy to make it conversational, Absolutely. Make it open, make it interesting for all of us. I hope we all benefit. Well, Martijn is a professor at the University of Amsterdam. He's a historian. He is author of several books, but one of the most important, famous is The Crimes of Elagabalus, and also published a textbook, book on character assassination, co-authored, also edited volume on character assassination, and handbook on character assassination. But Martijn, first question, how did you come up with this idea? How did it happen? You're a historian, you study ancient Rome, and then character assassination.
Yes, Eric, before I'm going to answer that question, I'm going to show the Routledge Handbook, because that's what we're celebrating with this series of interviews, the Routledge Handbook of Character Assassination and Reputation Management that was published earlier this year. Okay, so yeah, what got me interested in this? Well, you mentioned my my book, The Crimes of Elagabalus, and I'm sure many of you haven't heard of Elagabalus. He was a rather obscure Roman emperor who reigned for just a couple of years. I wrote my PhD thesis on him, and he gained a very wicked reputation in those few years that he sat on the Roman throne. And that got me interested and thinking about character assassination, because we spend so much time thinking about and researching how to build an image, how to protect an image, how to project a positive image on your surroundings, on your audience. But the opposite, I think, is just as important and happens just as frequently, namely that someone's image is attacked or undermined or for whatever reason destroyed. And that got me interested in the phenomenon of what we call character assassination. So Eric, you're still on mute.
Again, sorry. We hear from some people that history doesn't teach much, a little bit, but in general, what does history teach us in terms of character assassination?
Oh, well, I mean, how much time do we have? Because that's a very big question. Of course, I'm approaching this topic as an historian, just as you are approaching it as a political psychologist. And we had Jenny talking about rhetoric and communication earlier. And I think from an historical point of view, there is a lot to say about character assassination. Because one thing that makes this an interesting topic is to compare different cultures and see if there are some universal practices or things that we see happening across cultures. Are people attacked for the same reasons? Do audiences respond in the same ways? And history, of course, provides us with a lot of different historical cultures, where not only the norms and values and expectations that people have are different from ours, but also the level of technology and the infrastructure. So there are a lot of variables that you can play with That might help you discover, on the one hand, what might be universal characteristics and what might be more specific characteristics of attacking someone's reputation.
What you're right about very powerful women in history, and for example, Agrippina, Empress, right, and Theodora, and others. What do these examples, their examples, and attacks against these powerful women, what can we learn from those attacks, from those cases?
My chapter in the Routledge Handbook was about 3 empresses or queens, and one of these was indeed Agrippina. And I'm going to see if I can share an image with the group, because here she is. I hope you can all see this. So Agrippina is a Roman empress, and she was in fact of very high birth. She was the sister of the Emperor Caligula, the wife of the Emperor Claudius, and then she was the mother of the figure you see depicted here on the right, namely the Emperor Nero. So a woman in a position of high power, and apparently also a very ambitious woman. So in my chapter, I describe how she gains a very negative reputation in the writings of Tacitus, who is one of the most prominent historians of the Roman Empire. And Tacitus portrays Agrippina, in the blackest terms possible. She is a scheming, black-hearted harridan who poisons her own husband, the Emperor Claudius, just to get Nero on the throne, but then is unwilling to let Nero go, even tries to seduce him, tries to seduce her own son to an incestuous relationship just to make sure that he stays under her control. So she's depicted as this scheming, conniving, cruel, ambitious woman who's prepared to do anything to get power and stay in power. And that, of course, from a Roman point of view, is seen as a very masculine trait. So what Agrippina is doing there, in the eyes of Roman men at least, is trespassing. There are stories about her listening in on Senate meetings from behind a curtain, which you absolutely weren't supposed to do as a woman. And I think that is a large part of what made her so notorious to later generations, and why Tacitus writes about her in such a negative way. He uses her as an example of this is how an empress should not behave. This is how a woman in a powerful, prominent position should not behave. Instead, she should be obedient to her husband. She should follow him. She should be chaste. She should stay at home, perhaps weave clothes or do something like that, but certainly not meddle in political affairs, because that is men's terrain. And the reason that Agrippina didn't stick to these expectations means that she got portrayed in a very negative light by Tacitus and by other Roman historians who later then write about her. So that's one thing that we can learn, I think, from looking at these, to get back to your question, one thing we can learn from looking at these women like Agrippina is that what expectations for women actually were in a certain society, and what happens if women do not stick to these expectations. And the kind of accusations that you see made against this empress are also the kind of accusations that you read time and time again in Roman history. So Agrippina is not the only empress who is accused of incest, for instance, or of meddling into male affairs. That happens to a lot of the so-called bad empresses. And that tells you a lot about what these Roman men who wrote history, what they thought good behavior for an empress was.
You mentioned about gender trespassing, this great term. It's just, in fact, you're saying that in fact powerful men and other guardians of gender were punishing those powerful women for gender trespassing. And you mentioned about these certain functions the women supposed to play. Is it true it's about motherhood, right, and like a sisterhood and so-called wifehood, right? It's just those roles are prescribed, and then when they violate those perceived roles, they're punished by by being, well, emotionally and verbally assaulted, right?
Yes, I think that's exactly what's happening. There are, at least when we're talking about the Roman Empire, but I think the same is true for many traditional societies in the West and probably also beyond the West, that there are certain preset traditional roles that women are expected to play. One of them is indeed the role of motherhood. The most important thing a Roman empress had to be was a mother. And that is also one of the things where, of course, Agrippina fails. She has a son, Nero, and first she murders for him, but later she gets into a fight with him, as it were, and they end up on opposite ends, and in the end it gets to the point where Nero actually orders the murder, the assassination of Agrippina. So she is killed by her own son, but all her scheming and ambition are also portrayed as being done on behalf of her own son. And similar stories are told about an earlier empress, the Empress Livia, who was the wife of the Emperor Augustus. She is, in some hostile sources, portrayed as a woman who was scheming and even poisoning members within the imperial family just to make sure that Tiberius, her own son, would get to the throne. So it's sort of a perversion of this ideal of motherhood that should be a caring, nurturing, protecting role, a role bound to the house as well. It's a domestic role, but instead these women start meddling in politics as mothers, even on behalf of their own sons.
Why was at least perception in history about the Cleopatra being so bad? Was it just, why is it that image occurring in people's minds? Because of her connection to Roman empress, and why her connection to Roman empress was considered a liability to some of them?
Yeah, Cleopatra, of course, is a very famous case. She may be the most famous woman from the ancient world, full stop. And her reputation is, well, let's put it mildly, is mixed. And that was because Cleopatra ended up in a war with Rome. She, of course, as many people will know, had an affair with Julius Caesar when he was the most powerful man of Rome. Later, when Caesar was assassinated, she had another affair or an alliance with Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man and one of the contenders for supreme power. Mark Antony's rival was the later Emperor Augustus. As you know, Augustus won that war with Mark Antony, and that meant that Mark Antony and Cleopatra were very much tarnished with the brush of Augustan propaganda, because when these two were at odds with each other, so Augustus on the one hand, Mark Antony and Cleopatra on the other, he had some very nasty things to say about them. Mark Antony is portrayed as the slave of this Egyptian queen. And that's, of course, the worst thing that you can say about a Roman man, that he is subservient to a woman, because that's another way of saying that he's not truly a man at all. That's denying him all masculinity. And that, in turn, makes Cleopatra turns her into this image of the seductress who seduces first Caesar, then Mark Antony, and even prompts Mark Antony to betray his own country and side with Egypt instead of with Rome, as Augustus would put it. So you can then hit her with all the stereotypes of the seducing Oriental woman, because Egypt, of course, in Roman eyes, is also an Oriental country. And that means that it is associated with things like decadence, opulence, luxury, pleasure, instead of with things like rationality, masculinity, strength, and everything that Augustus and Rome stood for. So Cleopatra becomes the icon of the opposite of everything that Rome is fighting against. And even after she and Mark Antony have been defeated, that negative image sticks to her in later literature and even beyond antiquity.
So the idea that Roman emperor is supposed to be was weak vis-a-vis this foreign seductress probably played a negative role in his reputation within Rome. And in fact, the accusations of being cosmopolitan very common in foreign policy, by the way. So that's why history definitely repeats itself many ways. But Martijn, we talk about empresses and very powerful women, but were there any women senators in Rome? And just what history tells about attacks against them? Any facts, any knowledge do we have about those women?
Yeah, women could not sit in the Senate. So in the literal sense, there were no female senators, and the very fact that Agrippina listens in on Senate meetings from behind the curtain already shows how dangerously close she comes to the heart of power. But of course, many senators did have wives. So in that sense, there were senatorial wives, senatorial women, and they could certainly be the target of attacks. So when we look at, for instance, the time of the Roman Republic, when the Senate is still the supreme political body in Rome, before the emperors arrive, we see that there are some women who have, on the one hand, very stellar reputations. The mother of the Gracchi, for instance, is portrayed as this very virtuous woman, very caring mother, and are also women who do not fit that stereotype, and they are portrayed in very negative ways. So for senators' wives, as well as for empresses, there were some very strict traditional norms that they were supposed to adhere to. And as long as they did that and they fulfilled the role of mother, of wife, then everything was in order. So when you look at Roman tombs, Roman gravestones, for instance, which are erected in honor of women, it will often say she was an obedient wife, she took care of the children, and she spun wool. Because that's what the ideal woman did. And sometimes there's even wool depicted on the grave, because that's the highest praise that you can get as a woman. She stayed at home, she took care of the children, and she spun wool. And that's it, full stop. She didn't meddle in politics, she didn't sleep with other men, she did everything right.
One of our graduate students a few years ago did a very empirical study in America, comparing attacks against men and women during US presidential elections. And it was pure empirical study, caricatures and slanders on the web. And interesting that while attacks against men were so multiple and so diverse and so many kinds, so many types, the attacks against women were falling into four major categories, just surprisingly, but just stereotypically, it's surprisingly 4 categories for form. So basically, women were accused of a character attack, and that sorry for my language, but just we created those general images. Well, they're bitches, just powerful and influential women. They are whores, that's very sexual and very provocative and very good looking. They are witches, they are old and ugly. And there are also dumb blondes. They are just, sorry for that, Marilyn Monroe, just beautiful but absent-minded. And those, in fact, characteristics were attached to almost either of those was attached to most powerful women competing for presidential office a few years ago. Any examples from history, not necessarily Roman history, but history that we see that's those character attacks, those types were common, or at least were used?
Yeah, I think many of those stereotypes would be familiar to a reader of Roman literature. Agrippina, I think, would definitely fall into the bitch category. Someone who doesn't display traits that are typically valued in a woman, like softness, kind-heartedness, etc., but has these masculine traits for which a man might actually be praised, for being ambitious, for wanting to achieve things, get things done, not sit at home. But for a woman, that's a negative. When I think of the category of women who are sexually lascivious, then Messalina comes to mind, who is a previous Roman empress, a previous wife of the Emperor Claudius, who is said to have snuck out of the palace each night to sleep with as many men as possible, and to even have held a competition with a famous prostitute in Rome and who could sleep with the most men in a single night. And she finally, I think, beat her by sleeping with 25 men. So she was portrayed as sexually insatiable, but not as someone who, like Agrippina, was the politically scheming type. She didn't have political ambitions. She was just a sex-crazed woman, and that's the stereotype that's attached to her. When I think of another example, not from Roman history, but from Byzantine history, we get the Empress Theodora. I'll see if I can show you. Here she is. This is a very nice mosaic from Ravenna. You see, Theodora is an empress from the 6th century in Constantinople, the wife of the Emperor Justinian. And she seems to combine both those images. When we read hostile literature about her, her youth is described as very sexually adventurous. She was from the low classes. She grew up as an actress. And in ancient Rome and in ancient Constantinople, being an actress almost automatically meant that people assumed that you would also be associated with prostitution, because those two were very close to one another. Being a performer, using your body, putting your body on display. So we get lots and lots of stories about the sexual adventures of the young Theodora and how she would sell her body to every man. And then once she becomes the wife of the Emperor Justinian and she becomes the empress, we get what you would probably call the bitch stereotype of a woman who is ruthless, scheming, has people executed, has people persecuted, is always trying to wring every last cent of money out of them by accusations, and is abusing her power just like a male tyrant would do, in fact. So she seems to shift from one stereotype to the other.
Martijn, you and I argue that there are so-called central characteristics of character attack, cultural and also peripheral. And if you don't mind, there are questions now appearing, and I can start reading those questions. Actually, really timely. Question is, does Martijn think that these types of character attacks against powerful women are particular just for Western civilization, or is it typical for all patriarchal societies?
Yeah, I mean, this of course is an enormous topic, so I can't claim to be an expert on it. I think no one could really, and I'm certainly not an expert on non-Western history. But I mean, I think you can see similar patterns actually. I'm currently reading a book about the Chinese Dowager Empress Zhu Qi, who starts as a concubine in the palace in the 19th century, and then climbs up and becomes power behind the throne, as it were. And you see the same sort of stereotypes that you might expect in a traditional Western society. The ideal that women are really unfit to rule, that they are not rational, that they are just emotional, that they can't be trusted with power, etc., etc. The same sort of ideas that existed in Rome, that existed in medieval societies, we see as well at this Chinese court. So I'm not saying that every historical culture is exactly alike. Obviously, there are big differences in the way that women are portrayed and the expectations that people have of women. Nevertheless, there do seem to be some recurring patterns as well. And we could even ask, I think, to what extent those still apply to our modern Western democracies. Whenever a woman runs for office, we also get these stereotypes that she is, as you said, she's either a witch or a bitch, or she's a dumb blonde, or she's emotional, she's either too soft or she is too hard. It seems it's very hard to do a good job as a woman in power, because there is still that double standard. So I think to an extent it even persists in current societies.
By the way, anyone who wants to ask questions live, please just raise your hand and we'll do it. Maybe a rhetorical question, but Martijn, the question is, are there any words for women with in power that are not gendered and not negative. I think they are if those words deal with the action, actually, right?
So could you give an example?
Like just when we discuss, say, a women member of the Dutch Parliament, and she made a mistake, saying, well, she's making a mistake because this is not how things are, without implying that she's making a mistake because she is too emotional, right? I'm giving hypothetical.
Right, yes. Yeah, I mean, of course, not every accusation against a woman is necessarily tied to her gender. But I do think it is a very big factor, and that women are held to different standards than men, and are also, especially if they have powerful positions, more vulnerable to character attacks than men, because there is an unspoken assumption, and sometimes also a spoken assumption, by the way, that they are not supposed to be there.
When I read, well, just private letters of one of my favorite psychologists in 20th century, just 100 years ago, he clearly writes, put in writing to his colleague that he has plenty of options for his graduate students, but he prefers to have men because men are less emotional. That's very direct but implicit character attacks against women, saying they're wonderful PhD students, but candidates, but we'll all choose men because they're less emotional. So, and then continues that my lab work requires long hours and dedication, devotion, perseverance, and I prefer men. He put it in writing, in writing.
Yes.
Let's see if any. I got plenty of questions, by the way. Martijn, question is: does a woman's identity revolve around women's honor in the West, as it does in India and other South Asian societies? So, question of honor in the West and Roman history of ancient Roman and European history in general. Honor.
Honor. Well, I would say, speaking about the Roman Empire and about ancient societies more widely, that honor is typically something that is associated mostly with men. Men are supposed to be honorable. Men are supposed to have honor. And that honor can come from a lot of things. That can come from a good family background, for instance. That can come from military achievements, political achievements. And for women, the notion of honor does exist, but it is much more limited. And it is very closely tied to one thing, and that is chastity. A woman is supposed to be chaste. That, I think, is also the reason why so many of these character attacks against women attack them on a lack of chastity. So whether we're talking about Theodora and her adventures as a supposed prostitute in her younger years, or Messalina sneaking out of the imperial palace to sleep with many men, very often that there is this accusation that women are sexually loose, don't have their sexuality under control, or use their sexuality to control others, like Agrippina trying to seduce her own son, or many empresses or women in power apparently winding the man, the emperor, the king around their finger, and therefore gaining a lot of influence. So there's often a lot of distrust against these empresses or mistresses sometimes as well that rulers have, because they are in a very powerful position. They share a bed with the most powerful man in the kingdom, and who knows what they'll be whispering in his ear at night.
And you mentioned about chastity as an interesting phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
Which definitely gendered and gendered significantly and has been throughout centuries. But speaking of central features that character attacks against women had throughout centuries and culture particular, has anything changed in 21st century compared to, say, Roman Republic?
I mean, yeah, I would say so. I'm not that pessimistic. I mean, if you look at the amount of freedom that a woman would have had in the Roman Republic, especially, of course, I'm mostly talking about women of the upper classes, because their freedom was most restricted. Women who were from lower classes probably had no choice but to go out and work, just like the men did. They couldn't afford to just sit at home and spin wool, except when it was perhaps what they did for a living. So, but in the upper classes, when you look at the rights that women had and the expectations and the double standards, then I do think we've come a long way, especially in the 20th century. But it's really quite a recent development, and even some of the legal changes that we now have, like for instance that a woman who is married can still legally be her own person rather than being represented by her husband. That's a fairly recent legal development that's actually the case. That happened in the 20th century. So even though legally we've made a much progress, the question is, of course, are we mentally on the same page as well? And is everyone there? Some people undoubtedly are. Many other people are probably lagging behind, or are not there at all, and still think that the best place for a woman is in the kitchen.
The question was those stereotypes that's just we're discussing about powerful women and accusation being a whore, witch, dumb blonde, or and so forth. The question is, and I think we know the answer. I think I know the answer, but the question is, are these stereotypes contributing to further stigmatization of women?
Yes, I think so. When you look at these historical examples that I discussed in my handbook chapter, I think you can see very clearly that women who transgress the boundaries are taken to task for that, because history is written by someone like Tacitus, by someone like the author Procopius, and that's how these women will go down in history. You know, that they haven't left any documents of themselves that have survived. So our image of, for instance, Agrippina or Theodora or Messalina is very much determined by what these men later write about them. And in all these cases where empresses do not stick to gender expectations, they are taken to task for that. So that definitely stigmatizes them. If, as a woman, you dare to have ambitions or to involve yourself in politics, then that raises a lot of suspicions immediately.
So, questioning the motivation. But obviously, you don't study Dutch history, but any powerful women in Dutch history, recent history, that's can be compared to what you have studied, what you study.
Well, the thing is, of course, we don't have queens or empresses, and in the Netherlands, we even haven't had a female prime minister, for instance. But when I look at one of our neighboring countries, Great Britain, which of course not only had Theresa May, but earlier had Margaret Thatcher, I think you see a lot of the same things happening there. She was the first woman in power of a major Western country, and she was seen as behaving in a very quote unquote masculine way, in the way that she dressed, in the way that she behaved, and was mocked and attacked for that. She was portrayed as particularly harsh. If she would have gone the other way and have been very soft, she would have been attacked for that instead. But just the fact that this was I mean, I'm not saying that there wouldn't be anything to criticize about Thatcher's policy, and of course there can be genuine criticisms, but many of the attacks launched against her and against other powerful women have to do with the way that they behave, with the way that they dress. Look at Angela Merkel, for instance, where this issue comes up as well. A lack of elegance, which is apparently a bad thing. If you have too much elegance, then you are no longer taken seriously because it's too feminine. And those things were already true, I think, in traditional societies as well, and are still with us now.
So one of my students told me last year that when we discuss cases of Margaret Thatcher and Indira Gandhi and Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan, powerful women in power, my student said that perhaps for these women, just the anticipation that they'll be attacked for being soft and weak made them just act tougher. Of course, I know this. We can't pick the brain of those people in power, but maybe that's one of the cases. Just well, the desire, you're surrounded by men, you forced to play by the rules. You live and work in well, male culture, right? And that you have to somehow respond to their demands, and sometimes, yeah, I don't say it's compensate, but again, and I don't have empirical proof for that, but just the idea that you have to show that you're not that as much something. I'm too weak. I'm too weak.
Yeah. So what you might do is you're overcompensating,
Yeah.
Which is another trap.
Certainly. Yeah. So anything that's undiscovered in Roman history in terms of character assassination and the role of women, just something that's just we might see in the future, some new documents or some new ideas about the old documents and evidence that's have.
Yeah. Usually when we're talking about ancient history, we're not discovering so many new documents, at least not real historical texts. We do have papyrus fragments and inscriptions. But if you're talking about narrative history, then we're unlikely to find much more than we already have at the moment. So usually when something new is discovered, it is a new insight. And that, of course, that could certainly happen. There's still many things underexplored, I think, and it's only in recent decades that scholars have really seriously started looking at the role of women, and not just in society in general, but also powerful women. So what we now get, for instance, is these monographic studies being done on Roman empresses like Agrippina, like Livia. That's not something that people would have been doing 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. They would either say, well, it's not really interesting because it was the men who made the decisions anyway, or they would say there's not enough source material, so we can't really say much interesting things about it, so why bother? Those would be the usual excuses. But I think more recent scholarship has shown that there is a big potential, and that we can say more about these women, and that can lead to some very interesting studies, and also new perspectives, because rather than just seeing these women as pawns in a political game played by men, where we are saying, okay, how does Augustus make use of his wife Livia and his daughter Julia to further his dynastic needs? You can look at it from their perspective. What is their agency? What are they gaining from it? Someone like Livia probably had a whole power network of her own. I mean, she was in power along her husband for over 50 years. So you can be damn sure that she had her own networks. And then I think it's very good that we now start exploring that sort of question as well.
But there's a follow-up question here. Do you have the impression that Roman historiography, in Roman historiography, the role of women had been downplayed still
yes,
today?
Absolutely. When you look at Augustus, he has this big inscription that he puts up at the end of his life, the so-called res gestae. He puts it up at his mausoleum, and he lists everything that he's achieved. So it goes on for pages and pages if you read it. I've defeated that enemy, I've conquered that land, I've built that temple, etc., etc. He doesn't once even mention his wife Livia, whom he was married to over 50 years, who was right there with him in the palace, who we know from other sources gave him lots of advice, who had important functions, who was rewarded with the title of empress after his death, who was the mother of the next emperor Tiberius. She's not even there in the document.
Quick comment here that the Netherlands does have queens, right? But they do lots of PR work.
Sorry, the Netherlands does have what?
Queens, right?
Oh, queens. Yeah, yes, yes, we did have queens. More in a symbolic function, actually. But that's certainly true. And they're not. I don't think they're a very big target for character attack. Because they're by most people seen as a neutral symbol. They don't have any or much political power. So even people who would be in favor of having a republic don't really tend to go after them very much.
true that those roles, well, they're definitely facts tell us that in the 19th century, well, women in power, princesses and queens, played a significant role in the national affairs. Basically, Red Cross and the conference in The Hague, conferences in Hague, were organized under significant influence of women. But so they're working behind the scenes, and also they play their roles, right? They're just simply just advising, pushing, and taking care of so-called humanitarian issues. Let the war just be a man's issue, but we'll take care of the wounded, afflicted, of the weak. So those
yeah,
roles.
well, come to think of it, there was in the Netherlands in the early parts of the 20th century, Queen Wilhelmina, who had this very masculine persona or image about her. It was said that she was the only man in the Dutch government that Winston Churchill feared, for instance. So it would be interesting if there were any character attacks against her, but I'm not enough of a specialist to know anything about that.
So, well, how much time do we have? It's just, we've spent 40 minutes right here. So it's just, any mini just final comments, last words? So, well, people just think it just, and some people are leaving, some people have more comments. We have lots of interesting comments. Definitely we have to analyze them today and for the forthcoming days. And well, Martijn, anything else you want to say in conclusion? Just
No, just that I'm very happy that so many people turned up for this session. I know that we only really scratched the surface of what is a huge topic. And I hope that we can continue this conversation some other time, because there's a lot more to be said, and also by other people than just me, of course.
And Jenny put just on the screen that so we have next week will be a talk with John Cook and conspiracy theories. We will be here, and I invite everyone, and definitely will send messages and visit us on Facebook, on our website, and also we'll send you emails. We'll bother you. So stay safe, most important thing, just peace and love, and well, talk to you next week. See you next week, or even earlier.
Yes.
Thank you, Martijn and Eric, for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Really?